We're here with Chelsea Rooney, the author of Petal, her debut novel with Caitlin Press. Petal was a finalist for the 2015 Amazon First Novel Award, and the book blog 49th Shelf chose it as Book of the Year. CBC Books has listed her as a new writer to watch. So thank you so much for being here today, Chelsea.
Thank you for having me, Francine.
If you could tell us a little bit about yourself, that would be great.
Okay, my name is Chelsea. I wrote Petal. I am from Nova Scotia, the Annapolis Valley, Nova Scotia, a tiny rural village of 2,000 people. And I moved to Vancouver when I was 18. When I moved here, I had never seen an avocado before or used chopsticks, so it was quite a culture shock to be in the city, which I now know is a small city, but when I moved here it seemed like the biggest city in the world. I've been here for 14 years, so I kind of feel like I grew up here, and I'm a writer, I'm a novelist.
What first inspired that spark inside of you that made you want to become a writer?
Like the first memory I have of writing is being in primary, which is what we call kindergarten in Nova Scotia, and we're writing in our journals. I think we were writing letters, like the letters of the alphabet, and I wanted to write words. I kept writing words and stories, and I remember going up to my teacher, Mrs. Nixon, when I was 5, and asking her how to spell the sound ing, like walking, driving, swimming, how to spell that. She kind of looked at me and she was like, I think you're a little advanced for this. So she put me into the grade 1 writing class where we wrote short stories, and I was telling people at that age that I wanted to be a writer, so yeah.
What kind of genres do you find yourself being drawn to?
I'm pretty one-track minded when it comes to fiction. I'm trying to expand and get into like speculative and fantasy, but I've always been drawn to realism, literary fiction, realism. So that's what I write as well.
Do you ever find yourself writing any poetry or screen or for the stage?
I did back when I first started the undergraduate program at UBC. I actually entered as a poet and a stage play writer, but I took a fiction class on a whim. I was much more interested in writing for the stage and poetry, and I just found fiction to be my genre, and the long fiction to be where I could write the kind of stuff that I enjoyed writing the most.
Why do you think you're drawn to fiction?
I think we can ask questions in fiction that we can't ask in real life, and fiction, like novels, are the opposite of the hot take. Like, novels take time and they take long-term torturing yourself over a really difficult idea. I mean, that's why I write fiction. I write about things that I don't understand in an attempt to understand them or find a way to live in the world where horrible things exist. So yeah, that's what I've always written about, are things that keep me up at night. And fiction is just a place where we can take ideas that are really difficult and play with them, put them into imaginary people and put those people together and have those people put those people in tricky situations and have them figure things out that I didn't know before.
Could you tell me about the process of writing Petal? Why you chose to write about pedophilia in the way that you did, and why you chose to write from this character's perspective?
Okay. So I did not always intend to write a book about pedophilia or sexual abuse. I very much tried to avoid writing that book for many years. The story was always in the back of my head, but Petal originally began as a nonfiction thesis in sustainable farming practices in Canada. I was going to ride my bicycle across the country and visit farmers along the way and talk about ways that they were adjusting to climate change. And I tried to research for that book and organize those meetings, but I kept being drawn to researching the history of pedophilia and how we talk about abuse. And how we talk about people who have been abused, because I was abused as a child, and I didn't start thinking about how my experience of abuse was informed by the way people talk about pedophiles. And when I started researching that and researching the literature around trauma, I, was confronted with ideas that were contrary to my own experience, and I found them to be disempowering and unproductive in terms of healing from abuse and being in the world as a whole person, without the constant idea that you are somehow defective or tainted for life because you have been abused. So that's why I started researching, and I was really obsessed with the research. And I had no idea that it was going to turn into a book. I just started researching, and wherever my interest went, I just followed it. I didn't question why I was researching these bizarre things. I just followed my the drive, and eventually the story started to come to life in my head, and I just started writing, and it poured out of me. The first draft took only 6 months, and it was like 350 pages, which I ended up having to cut about 100 pages of the nonfiction research I had done. I tried to include it in the book because I found it really fascinating, and I think it's really, I thought it was like a good opportunity to educate the public about the ways narratives about abuse get constructed and how they actually can harm victims of abuse. But various readers told me that the nonfiction stuff didn't fit into the book, so I had to take it out and just keep the narrative of the bicycle trip across the country.
So I've started reading it. I haven't gone all the way through it yet, but from what I can hear you talking about, so you related, I think, quite closely with the protagonist.
Yes,
then?
I did. Probably too closely I related to the protagonist. I definitely won't be writing another book that is as autobiographical. However, it was a wonderful experience for me to contextualize my experiences as a child and a teenager and an adult dealing with the long-term impacts of abuse. Yes.
So is the sister character based on someone real?
I do have a sister, but the sister in the book is very different from my sister. All the characters they're all inspired by real life, but I think as soon as you intend to write fiction, regardless of what inspired it, it's fiction. And I kind of have to make that distinction, just because if I didn't, it would be a different process of writing, right? It wouldn't be writing fiction, it would be writing nonfiction, creative nonfiction.
Can I ask why you didn't go the creative nonfiction route?
Yeah, and I didn't write a nonfiction book because of what I mentioned earlier about the reason I write fiction, which is I don't know, it's not a conscious decision that I make, but for whatever reason, I enjoy creating very difficult circumstances, putting characters into them, having those characters embody ideas that I don't understand, and seeing what happens, and seeing what truth comes from having these ideas interact with one another in these difficult situations.
What has the response been to the novel?
It's been really positive. I haven't had any backlash to my face. I'm sure there's been some behind the scenes. I expected to have more people disagree with the premise of the novel and also some of the ideas in the novel. The premise is the protagonist, Julia, is a counseling psychology student. She's studying trauma, and her thesis is that not all sexual abuse is traumatic. Sexual abuse between adults and children that is done in a gentle, loving, non-painful context can happen without trauma. That's what Julia believes. And I think she has to believe that in order to be okay in the world. She doesn't want to be traumatized. She doesn't want to think that there's always going to be something wrong with her. So I've had people say, like, I'm going to read your book and then I'm going to get mad at you about the stuff that you say, and then they take it and they read it and then they see that I'm not proposing any truth or like stance on abuse. I'm just presenting someone's experience and kind of holding it up for questioning and asking, are there other ways we can look at this that would maybe be more helpful for both people who experience abuse and people who are attracted to children, because there are many people who are attracted to children who don't abuse children. And if our culture kind of relaxed around, you know, childhood sexuality and stuff like that, we would probably be able to more compassionately and effectively like help the people who are pedophiles and who do not abuse children.
For you, what makes a book super compelling? What sort of draws you through a book?
Oh, that's a good question. The books that I can't stop reading, like the page turners, it's usually about character for me. Plot is pretty secondary. It doesn't really matter what's happening. A character can be like moving from the bedroom to the kitchen or moving from Hong Kong to Canada, and as long as they are striving to figure something out, bumping up against obstacles. Setting, I guess, is also important. I like learning when I'm reading. I tend to read novels about things I don't know a lot about. So if the setting is really rich, I'm thinking of A Visit from the Goon Squad by Jennifer Egan, which I've read twice, and it's about like the punk rock scene in Los Angeles in the 80s, and it's just it's like a movie. It's books that are like movies. I tend to read more quickly. Yes.
Is there one thing in terms of like craft, the writing craft, that you've been trying to really work on in your own writing right now?
Yes. I really like realism. I'm writing realism. Sometimes, though, realism can be hard to write because it's very character focused. So, like, I find myself writing a lot of conversations, right? Two characters sitting in a room having a conversation. And that's not very exciting because there's not a lot of action. So something I've been focusing on when I write is the emotional journey of a scene. And this is something that Nancy Lee told me a couple years ago. Before my book came out, I went to see her. I was in the editing stage and I went to see her and asked her, because I had just read The Age by her, which is one of my favorite books, and she does so well the thing that I was trying to do, which is just have two characters talking to each other, but for it to feel like this expansive revelatory, dramatic moment, even though they're just sitting at the kitchen table talking. And I asked her how she did that, and she recommended that I watch Mad Men. And I was like, I have watched Mad Men, like I've watched that series probably 3 times. And she explained how the reason Mad Men is so compelling, even though it's so slow and so quiet, is because of the emotional journeys in each scene. So the characters, you start a scene with a happy character and you end a scene with a sad character. It doesn't just go from happy to sad, it goes from like happy to disappointed to jealous to envious to excited again, back to happy, back to disappointed. It's and if you hit each of those points in the graph, that for the reader is like action and drama, even though there's no movement. And that's what I'm focusing on right now as I write.
Do you have any advice for someone who is just deciding that they want to become a writer?
Okay. My advice for someone who is just deciding that they want to become a writer is to read as much as possible and as widely as possible, and to write about things that excite them, and to not write about things that don't excite them. I think there's a lot of pressure. I mean, I have in the past felt pressure to like do the hustle thing, the freelance hustle thing alongside my fiction, and I really admire people who do freelance writing. It has never been something that I wanted to do, but I have felt pressure to do it because that's how you get paid for writing, is you write nonfiction alongside fiction. But I think everybody's different, and if you're not drawn to a project, just try to follow your inner compass as much as you can. There's a lot of, the writing industry is multifaceted, and there are many things that you can do to take part in it. For me, what's important to me is that I continue to write from a place of like wanting to discover and wanting to learn about how to be a better person. And if the writing isn't doing that for me, then I tend to find it very difficult. So my advice is to read, write all the time, finish something. Like, I remember when I first came to Vancouver, I went to see Anne-Marie MacDonald read after she had just released The Way the Crow Flies, and I raised my hand to ask a question at the end of the reading, and my voice was like shaking. I was like 18 years old, and I was like, "Do you have any advice for young writers?" And she just said, "Write and finish. That's all you can do, is write something and finish it, and then a whole other world will open up of things that you have to do. But until you finish something, that should be your only goal."
Where can people find you online?
ChelseaRooney.com. I'm also on Twitter. I really like Twitter, and I have found so many interesting people and learned so much from Twitter. And I try to be funny on Twitter, but I think my tweets come off as very angry because I have a lot of anger. But when I'm tweeting, I'm like, and then like I go back and look at the tweet the next day and I'm like, oh man, that is an angry tweet. So if you follow me on Twitter, know that I'm usually I'm usually smiling when I tweet. And yeah, I host a monthly episode of the Storytelling Show on Vancouver Co-op Radio, and I'm not on Facebook.
Thank you, Chelsea, for coming down here to the beach with me today and talking to me about your writing process.
Thank you for having me. It was great.